Hello everyone, Louis here from Spitfire Audio, and welcome to the second video of our One Orchestra series. Here is where we acknowledge all things BBC Symphony Orchestra related, whether that's walking through a piece of music, using the BBC SO libraries, to sharing some tips and tricks, using other orchestral scores as inspiration, and even sharing music that you create with the libraries when you upload your music using the hashtag OneOrchestra. So do stick around for the end of the video to see if you were featured. Now, this video marks another important landmark of our BBC SO history. It's been a whole year since our Discover and Core versions of the library were released. These two versions of the library followed the release of our professional edition, with the Discover edition of the library being available for free. So there's no reason not to download and get some orchestral creativity out your fingertips. So to celebrate, I'm here to show you a little demo I whipped up using BBC SO Discover in Ableton Live 11. That also means we can use the sample packs Spitfire released exclusively for Live 11. So for this piece of music, I've used the upright piano pack, and I've got to say it's definitely a favourite of mine. Just as a side note, if you were curious about the packs we've released for Ableton Live 11, there is a walkthrough that I've done showing off all the packs, and there's some really cool MPE instruments in there, so do give it a watch if you're curious. Now, we've heard big, fantastical, bombastic orchestral demos with the BBC SO library, so I decided for this piece I was going to restrict myself and use the orchestra in a much more stripped back sense, not only to allow the piano to shine through, but also to try writing in a much more reserved style. Sometimes when composing, I tend to overcomplicate things and add lots of different elements that make the music sound far too busy. So writing this bit of music was a good little exercise for me, and hopefully the breakdown will help you realise and overcome any similar tendencies. Just before we get into my demo, I want to shed some light on a composer that hugely inspired this track, and that is Masumi Ueda. Ueda made his name as a composer back in the 90s, where he joined the Japanese video game company Capcom to write music for their new game at the time, Resident Evil. The game quickly became a very popular survival horror franchise, with Ueda at the helm of the music for the earlier releases. Now, my piece is inspired by his works on Resident Evil. I do love a bit of horror, and as a brief bit of context, the games involve the player trying to survive various horrific outbreaks, more often than not involving zombies, in a claustrophobic setting, as the player unravels mysteries throughout the story and ultimately tries to make it out alive. The second game has the player trapped in an overrun art museum turned police station, where they have found a slight reprieve from the horror in the front hall. Let's have a listen to the second game's front hall theme. The little piano runs in that cue are iconic, creating lots of space by leaving the arrangement quite sparse. Using the low drone in the strings to build tension and choosing to have little passages from the piano and other instruments scattered throughout really frames that uneasy feeling and is perfect for the context and setting of the game. You never know if you're truly safe. A main occurrence in Resident Evil games is having save rooms, where the player can manage their storage space and save progress without being torn to pieces. The music of these save rooms has become instantly recognisable, especially from the earlier games, which were Ueda's work. Here's Ueda's save room theme for the first game. Again, we've got that uneasy feeling, and I love how he voices these extension chords on the guitar, making the harmony feel a little bit uncertain. Here's one final piece I want to highlight before we break mine down, which is Ueda's save room theme for the third game. You can hear the strings more at play here, with a nice little delay effect on the piano, still retaining a similar low drone just like the front hall theme from the second game. These three cues are the main pieces of Ueda's work that inspired my piece. So with that being said, I've had a crack at creating my own sort of save room music using piano with BBC SO Discover, keeping the orchestra quite reserved yet still effective. Here's the piece. I've started the piece with a bit of a slower tempo at 88 BPM, as this is more of a reflective piece rather than a flurry of excitement. In terms of structure, about halfway through the piece, we more or less repeat the music, with some slight changes in the melodies and the voicings, and with the addition of a harp. The idea behind that was to have about a minute of music that could almost be a seamless loop back to the beginning. The Ueda's cues that I played before are about a minute long each, but the end feeds right back into the beginning, because being a video game cue, the length of the music is dependent on the player's actions. And in the context of Resident Evil, that's how long they're in the save room for. So the ending of my piece almost finishes identically to how it starts, so it can loop back round. Taking a look at the piano, I've split it into 3 parts, with our lower bass notes, then our kind of middle arpeggios, and then our higher sort of melody line on the top there. This is just to have a bit more control over the mix, and so I can automate certain lines, which we'll get into in a moment. Here I've used about 3 chords in total, with pretty much all of them being minor flattened 6th chords. I've voiced these slightly apart, just so it's not as clustered, and the way the arpeggios are laid out, it's almost like we're playing 2 fifth intervals right next to each other, creating a bit of dissonance. We're predominantly in an F minor key and centre around that chord, but we've added a few extra notes outside of the key to give it that air of mystery, similar to what Ueda has done, particularly for the first Resident Evil's save room theme. So here are the chords. Firstly, we have our F minor flat 6th chord. We move up to our A flat minor flat 6th. And down to our C minor flat 6th. And then we go to a C minor add 9 with an E flat in the root. Like I said, we're mostly sticking on that F minor flat 6th chord, so the piece is a real slow burn to build that atmosphere up. But we see these later chords creep in with our higher piano melody. For the start of these loops, I've created a simple little delay-like effect just by automating the volume, so it sounds as if our arpeggios are dying away. We've got our left hand playing these bass notes just on the root of these chords, apart from one of our C minor voicings where we have an E flat as our root, alluding to a slightly more major tonality. These low rumbling piano notes give off that sinister feeling, being pretty prominent in Ueda's front hall theme from the second game. Looking at the higher melody track, we have the piano playing a 5th interval that moves up a semitone, providing some dissonance, like so. It's really at the top end of the register there. And then over the course of the piece, we reach our main melody, which sounds like this if we include our arpeggios. I feel that the passage is both quite spooky but also quite pretty, and having the whole range of the piano used throughout the piece really fills the space while also creating a lot of space through how each part has been voiced. Let's move on to our strings. We've got our first violins playing a really simple passage, lingering on notes, creating these higher drones, giving us a little bed for the piano to sit on. I particularly like this little moment where it holds on a C as our melody plays over it. And I'm gradually decreasing the dynamics by automating that note just there. And that goes for the whole of the string section and the flutes as well. I've tidied up the expression and dynamics in the automation editor here to give it a bit more life and realism. In the repeats, we have a little counter melody from our string section here as our piano melody returns, sounding like this. So as well as hearing the first violins with our piano just there, you would have heard the second violins supporting our first violins in the counter melody. I really like the tone of these samples, so I mostly used the tremolo patch in our second violins to add a bit of texture. Again, this helps convey that anxious feeling, and by using the faders to have this swell in and out, it creates a really interesting layer. Towards the end, to support the first violin counter melody, I switched to the long articulation in our second violins, just so we get more of a secure and definitive sound. And you can see I've created a little crossfade between the second violin tremolo track and the second violin long track. Next, we've got the cello and bass with an extra sub sine wave to help thicken our lower strings. Christian's actually done a little tutorial on how to make your string parts sound really fat, so we'll leave that linked below. These lower strings are where we have our deep drone that Ueda has frequently used in the Resident Evil pieces. We've got the bass pretty much supporting the cello here by playing an octave lower, and then the sine wave playing an octave lower than that. See if you can hear it. I like that slow, sinister ascension there as we change chords. At the end, the cello slightly deviates from the bass just before and during the counter melody section as we fade out to the end, sounding like this. To add to the higher register, I've got a flute here in the woodwinds, playing a solitary line from the rest, adding even more dissonance to our other elements. I really like how it goes from playing lower in its register to higher just there. I was initially going to use a piccolo for this bit because I like the tone of that instrument, but I chose the flute instead as it's got that range, so I feel it worked quite well. A little tip as well is if you're using long notes in the woodwinds and the brass, don't forget to break them up to sort of simulate the players taking a breath. Now the harp joins us in our first piano sequence and continues throughout the piece, playing these plucked chords and adding a passing note or two during the repeat. Let me show you what the chords sound like on the harp. Slightly staggering the notes gives you that rolled effect, which sounds really nice. Now I adore the Celeste, and it fits perfectly with the style that I'm going for here, adding a bit of a different sound with the twinkling keys, blending really nicely with our higher piano melody. Initially I was going to perhaps use the glockenspiel for this line, but the tone of the Celeste was a lot warmer and not as harsh as the glockenspiel, so it was perfect to give the melody a bit of a twinkle. There is a little bit of percussion in this piece, although I've used it sparingly, just a little bass drum hit to signify certain moments in the piece, as well as juxtaposing with the more drawn out and softer elements. So here's that bass drum sound with a little bit of added reverb. And the final track is our tubular bells. They give us a nice little gothic element, and they play 3 times at the start, at the transition into the repeat, and at the end there. A nice bit of reverb on that helps it to ring out even more than it already does. Just looking at the mix, this send is going to our Lexicon 224 reverb, and we've got it on the large hall setting there. You can see we've got that turned up pretty high for most of the tracks, especially with our higher elements in the strings, the celeste, and the piano. I didn't do too much panning as BBC SO comes panned to the usual orchestral seating arrangement, which is quite handy, so I've only slightly accentuated the flutes by panning them to the left, as well as moving the sub to the left, just so it doesn't sit right in the middle. On the master, we've just got a couple of EQs to add a bit of air and take out some of the lows, so it doesn't get too muddy, as well as having a vintage tape plugin to add a bit of saturation, as well as an imager just to widen the space in the mix, both courtesy of Isotope, and then we've also got our limiter here. Let's give the piece as a whole one more play to round everything up. So that was one example of using piano with the orchestra. Below you'll find a link to the final mix of the session and MIDI of the piece for you to look through. Now it's time to show off some of your creations you've shared using the hashtag #OneOrchestra. Firstly, we've got a piece titled The Letter by Matt Lytle, who also used his piano with BBC SO Discover. We've got another Discover piece from Den Jeleckic, which is simply enchanting. Next we have George Soulis, who's done an incredible orchestral rendition of Queen's Love of My Life using BBC Symphony Orchestra. Take a listen. Nick Stride has written a beautiful tribute to his late father Sebastian using BBC SO. Thank you so much for sharing. Lastly, we have a piece of music titled At Station 9 by Mitch Krebs. Mitch has also been featured on our monthly Labs community playlist, which is another opportunity for you to get involved and submit your music using our free range of Labs instruments, using the hashtag LabsCommunity. Details are in the description. Once again, you'll find all of these brilliant composers and their pieces linked in the description below, as well as a link to the session and MIDI file of my piece. We're looking forward to hearing much more of your music, so get involved for the opportunity to be featured here on One Orchestra by uploading and tagging your BBC SO pieces with the hashtag OneOrchestra. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you fancy, and let us know what you want to see covered in the next video in the comments below. As always, remember to download the Discover edition of BBC SO if you haven't already, so you can start creating orchestral scores right now. It's free. Thanks ever so much, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.